Thank you very much for having me. I'm actually here by default. It should be Sue Wade, who's actually my supervisor. I'm clearly not Sue. I'm actually Phil Waters, and she couldn't make it, so she said, but I do know a guy who you might want to listen to because he's doing a lot of video. So hence I'm that guy who's doing a lot of video. I am going to begin, and Rebecca's kind of giving you a kind of highlight really about the perspective and angle I'm going to take here, is I am, both in my heart and in my head, a practitioner. I've been working with children for over 22 years now, mostly in a play context, but also in an educational context. And so I come at research from this praxis point of view, and that's the angle I'm going to take throughout my presentation. So forgive me for those that aren't practitioners. I will try and kind of elucidate when I talk about certain terms how they relate to practices with children. I'd like to begin by just kind of highlighting the kind of themes I'm going to address throughout my talk. But actually I'm not just going to talk on my own, you actually can hear some children talk, so you get to hear those voices. But also I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit, not just at the end, I'm actually going to ask you to contribute at 2 points through the presentation when you see some of the film. So I'm going to talk about some of the methodological challenges that you might have in researching small people, children, when they're on the move. Anybody that's either has children or works with children know that actually they're highly active little beings, and trying to track them and keep a track of them when using cameras and stuff is quite hard work. Also, I want to talk a little bit about collecting data over time and space, particularly the kind of spaces that I'm working in and the kind of spaces that children find themselves in, and the complexities that this generates when you're collecting video data. Also, I want to talk a little bit about the difficulties about the parts in your data that you focus on and the choices you make about why you focus on certain parts. Anybody who's worked, actually I ought to ask, how many people work with video in research here? So we've got a few. Well, those that work with video, you know that actually you have a huge amount of data and you have to decide what you're going to do with that data. And sometimes you have to make selections about what it is you're going to look at. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And also I'm going to talk about the coding and analysis structures that I'm using, but particularly the challenges and the opportunities that they afford in research. To kind of set the scene, this is not my stuff, this is actually Sue Wade's stuff, so she did put a bit of herself in here. Sue's given me a couple of her background studies, really to build up to the study that I'm doing and why I'm using the methods and the way I'm using them. And so Sue's 2005 study, which actually was conducted in 2001, was really Sue doing what most ethnographers do when they're in a classroom context. Normally, they would stand at the back with their clipboards and they make observations and they keep themselves away. But Sue particularly wanted to study those kind of micro interactions that happen when students are engaging with computer screens, but also with their peers next to them. She couldn't do that in a typical observational way. She had to locate herself as a researcher into that micro context with those children, which means she had to place herself next to the students. That's the only way she could gather her data. At the time, she wasn't using any kind of digital technology. Now, of course, that kind of method conjures up all sorts of problems and complexities. Needless to say that it has an effect on the context and on the children themselves. And so, to kind of start the ball rolling, I want you to think about, you're in a context with children, you're trying to gather data about those children, but you then have to start considering what part do you play as a researcher in the kind of generating of that data. Secondly, Sue's other research project, which happened in 2007, took her out of this classroom context and put her into a forest school context. So now she's out in the open, she's free ranging, gone wild with her clipboard and her pen. Of course, the trouble, when you're free ranging out in the wild, you get all sorts of weather and climate that has an effect on the way you collect data. So she was getting lots of soggy, wet clipboards, collecting stuff in the rain. So again, not the best way of collecting data. But what it did do, it changed the way she worked dynamically. This time, she was allowing the participants to move, they're not static, and also she would follow them. Again, following children in certain contexts has an influence on the kind of data you're going to generate. And I'll come back to those later on in my study. And finally, when Sue did decide to use some digital technology, she put little cameras on children's heads, and she was trying to look at the transition between school processes and ages. And one of the difficulties with using cameras on heads is that children do this. And so what you get is you get this image that's like that. And as a researcher, it's not very good for you for analysing data when it's moving about all the place. So again, although Sue was able to capture the data real time, there was on her camera, she wasn't able to analyse it because the kids are moving their heads too much. And so you're constantly fighting with the data and how you collect that. So taking those all into context, when I came about my research, and I have a background also in filmmaking, so naturally I wanted to work with cameras in my research data collection, then I had to consider, well, how am I going to capture some of the things I want to capture in natural environments with video, knowing that these are all the issues one might encounter. And so I'm going to begin my presentation by starting with this as a kind of backdrop. So prior to setting up my own business called I Love Nature, I've been working for the Eden Project in Cornwall for about 7 years. Those that don't know the Eden Project, think of it as a huge hole in the ground, which was an ex-clay mining area, and then some bright individual came along and said, hey, let's stick a garden in that big hole. And so they did, they stuck a garden in this big hole, and we actually have one of the biggest rainforests in captivity in a bubble-shaped greenhouse, if you like, stuck to the side of the clay mining quarry. And now we've been running for about 15 years, and we've contributed something like £1 billion to the local economy through the work that we do at the Eden Project. My job with Eden was the play project coordinator, or as I was telling Rebecca, I was often called Playboy, not for the reasons you might suspect. And my idea was that I had to generate projects and design projects to get children and families out into nature. During this work, I developed a pedagogic praxis that uses story and narrative to really get children excited about the natural world. It's a way of planting narrative cues into the environment that help children get really interested in nature. As I started to evolve this work, I started to get into how could I use narrative to help children be more physically active in the natural environment. And this is where my study began. So I'm conducting research with Exeter Medical School alongside Plymouth University, and with Eden Project as my business partner, and I have 2 studies. In my first study, I wanted to go into a school environment and see how did children play in their natural spaces without any interventions from adults. What did children get up to? How do they physically move about? What parts of the landscape do they engage with? How do they engage with each other when they're playing? These are the kind of questions I was interested in. From that study, I was going to evolve a way of using narrative to have an influence on the way they get physically active in those spaces. So I'm looking for this transition. I ought to clarify that my research is about evolving narrative journey praxis. It's not about coming up with grand theories or trying to prove anything major. It's about evolving a form of praxis. This was a vehicle for me to continue evolving narrative journey. Now, of course, when you're doing work with children in an outdoor context, you have to pick the right kind of environment. And so I was very lucky in Cornwall. There's a small Steiner-orientated school on the back of a farm. And actually, this is an image from that school. They are completely off-grid, so they have no electricity. They operate their classrooms at these 2 yurts. And they spend a considerable part of their day outside. For me, that was an optimum research environment when you're interested in children's effect on the environment outdoors, when they spend most of the time outside. They only have 30 children registered at this school. They do now have a second site for children over 8 years, but at the time I was researching, they just had children from 3 to 8 years. 28 of those children took part in the research. The other 2 didn't because their parents didn't give consent for them to be featured on video cameras, and I'll talk about those issues later. I, however, apart from focusing on those 28, was focusing on 5 children, so just a very small sample. I picked a very small sample because I had a huge array of behaviours I wanted to explore, and so having a sample, such a small sample, enabled me to explore a big array of behaviours in this sample group. I'm actually using a mixed methods approach in the whole of my research, but I'm only going to focus on a couple of those that orientate me first towards visual methods. The first one is behaviour mapping. I actually followed this work of Neil DeCosco and Professor Robin Moore at the Natural Learning Initiative at North Carolina State University. They use this particular method to help them design play spaces, natural play spaces, by observing children's behaviours, taking that learning and then planting that into how you might design a playscape. What I liked about the method is it enabled you to look at all those tiny interactions children have with the landscape in lots of different ways. However, I'm interested in stories and narrative and how that can have an effect on the way children are physically active in the environment. So that's the only part of behaviour mapping they didn't have, was this narrative element. So I added on to their behaviour mapping a dialogic mapping element. So that was as much as a measure and quantify and look at children's behaviours in the landscape, I wondered, well, what part does narrative play in that landscape and with those children? How does narrative work across the landscape? Does it influence the way children engage with different parts of that landscape and with each other? So I was interested in those elements. And to capture all this wonderful, rich sensory data, I decided I was going to use film and cameras, much like the one you can see on this chair, which is called a GoPro camera. GoPros, those that don't know them, are often used in the sports and fitness kind of environment. People jumping out of airplanes have GoPros on them, or on sticks, or people diving in the sea. They're very robust. I could throw that out the door and it would probably survive. So from working in an environment where children are throwing themselves around quite a lot, being really physically active, GoPro seemed to be the ideal solution for me capturing all the kind of data about their behaviours. However, you've got to remember, I'm in a Steiner school that's completely off-grid with no electricity, and there I am introducing some quite high-end technology. So there's kind of like this kind of conflict of interest here, both ethically but physically as well. But they were really good. The parents and the staff recognised that actually film would give them an insight to what children are doing when they're not around those children. And so they were as much curious. And the children were particularly curious about the cameras, and again you'll get to see some of this in a moment. So I planted 9 cameras around the environment in a way that I thought would capture Big Brother style, the way that children might move about their landscape. Some of them are on buildings, some of them hidden in trees, some are on 3-metre high poles up in the landscape, capturing children from all different angles. Not all the cameras caught everything I wanted it to do, because you always get these blind spots, and you don't discover these until you're way into your research. But to give you an idea of the kind of field of view you get from using cameras in an environment, I'm going to show you a sequence of film, and it's primarily from these 3 points of view. So we've got one here, the film begins with a camera hidden amongst the trees. You'll get a sense of that when you see it in a moment. Then the perspective shifts over to a camera that's up on this 3-metre high pole. Pay attention to that one, it's kind of interesting. And then it shifts again, and it's on top of a shed. There is a 4th camera, but I'm not going to say anything about that. I'll let you discover that for yourselves in a moment. But what you're going to see is you're going to see a child, a young girl, moving through the environment carrying this big piece of play equipment. And I just want you to imagine, what am I looking at here? What kind of physical behaviours do I see? But when the camera shifts perspective, what does that do for you? And then I'm going to just ask you just to give me, no questions, just kind of give me your responses, just a few feelings. So watch this clip for a moment. Oh, can I ask you, can I drop the lights? Now we're 3 metres in the air. Oh, you can see her just going through the trees on the top of the screen. the cameras.
No, she can't breathe. Where?
Okay, so before I say anything about my observations, any observations? Anybody have any concerns? Does anybody here has children? Okay. So if your child was underneath that cone, what would you have done?
I'd have probably broken it. I'd probably intervened in the play.
Yeah, that's a good point. I presented this actually to a group of early years practitioners about a year ago, and it took one person at the end put her hand up and she said, do you know what? I wouldn't have allowed that to happen. I would have walked in there and intervened. I would have lifted that cone up because health and safety would have said, oh, she's suffocating. That was her kind of response. I'm going to come back to that because I'm going to show you another sequence later on which tells that story again in a different way. For observations, as far as behaviours, there's a huge array of potentially codable behaviours in that sequence. And the way that she picks things up, her embodied experiences with the objects, the way she carries it, all those things, she's using her body in a physical way. What's really interesting, what kind of sets up, I guess, the research that I'm interested in is that there's a huge body of research now, both in Europe, but particularly in the States, that says there's a big group of young people at school who are forced to do formal PE in sports. To the point that actually evidence suggests that for those who don't like it, it actually turns them off from wanting to live healthy, active lifestyles because they feel they're forced to do something they don't really enjoy. Yet in the play sector, there's another big body of research that says actually if you leave children out to play, they will be highly physically active in their environment. So there's this kind of conflict going on between formal PE in sports and more informal physical activity. And what I'm interested in is what is the experiences children have informally when they're physically engaged in an environment, and what part can narrative inform that? And just one quick question. Anybody have any thoughts or reflections when the camera shifted to that high-end position, the 3-metre high pole? Did anybody feel anything different about the way they were viewing the landscape or the environment?
Gave you a very good idea of how many children were around.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah, and actually that's the reason I stuck it up there, was taking it above the trees, so I got a broader sense. Anyway,
I did have kind of George Orwell association, but I mean that's not.
right. Well, it's interesting because actually the thing it does do as an observer, it puts you into an artificial viewpoint. We do not see the world 3 meters up in the air. And so when you're coding behaviors, you have to take into consideration, what am I now seeing on the world? What part of the world am I seeing? And how does it shift me as a researcher? I'll come back to that when I show this clip because it's more poignant. So be aware, cameras shift around and change the way we might view the world and our perspective and how we might code that world. Okay, so I'm interested in children's physical behaviours, and I was looking for a way that I could classify these in a kind of playful way. Well, there aren't many. There's a whole body of work around physical literacy now, but not a lot of it's been done in the play sector, in the play world. However, in the sports world, Professor George Gray, who's now retired, again from America, he created what he calls this movement analysis wheel. And it was a way of being able to classify the way that children might physically move about when they're doing formalised PE in sports in school settings. And so in the centre of his wheel, he had the 3 major categories of locomotor, that's when you move through space and time, manipulative actions, such as picking up an object and throwing it, and non-manipulative, such as bending over and stuff like that. And then under that, you would have a whole series of different types of behaviours that you would then classify under these categories. And then on the outer side of this wheel, if you imagine you could spin it in one and match it to the outer one, you would then ask questions of those kind of behaviours. So you might say, well, where in the environment do you see this particular behaviour? When they're running, is it in a zigzag pattern? Those kind of questions. So what you're doing, you're building up a kind of repertoire of different ways that children interact with their landscapes. The downside with this particular model is that, again, there were an awful lot of behaviours that weren't in here. Actually, most of them were sports orientated, and I'm looking at plays. So things like children crawling around in the bushes, for example, for the sake of just crawling around the bushes, is not on this coding scheme. So I had to spend quite a lot of time in my first study, and I was doing an iterative kind of process of keep on building up my behaviour coding scheme. It's huge, hundreds and hundreds of codes. And then what I would do is I take all this data, all these behavioural observations, and put it into a software program called Nodus Observer XT, which is a behaviour software program. And what this enables me to do is ask questions of the data, and then it would output certain answers by comparing and contrasting all those different questions. However, when anyone's worked with video, you know that you have a huge amount of data and you have to decide what to do. To give you an example of how much data I had, a 10-minute sequence of film takes me a day and a half to code. So when you end up with 50 hours worth of film, and you can't possibly spend all your time coding that in a PhD. So I had to consider, how was I going to sample this data? So I went for a very simple time sampling method. I would pick my 5 children. Child A, for example, on day 1, I might take the first 10-minute sequence of a film in the first hour of play that they're playing, and I would only code that. And then I would go to child B, who would have the next 10 minutes in that hour, and C, and so on and so forth. And then on day 2, they would all get shifted along. The idea is that across a period, every child will be featured somewhere in a 10-minute segment, a different 10-minute segment, in each hour of play. And so that way I was trying to cover the children across the whole week that they were being studied. Now, so far, I told you the story of what happens when you put cameras up here. Those cameras give you the third-person objective, the view on the world that most of us take when we're observing other people. However, I'm really interested in children's stories and narratives, and I really want to know how they view the world themselves. So, I equipped those same 5 children in my same studies with the GoPros on chest harness cameras. And what I did was in study 2, I added a tracking camera, so they could follow them through the environment. And also I would wear a camera because I'm a practitioner researcher, I'm doing an intervention, I'm using story in the way that I work. And now I want you to see that same sequence again, but this time you're going to see it from the point of view of the girl that's carrying the code. And then I'd like your reflections on this sequence. So a very different experience, the same story retold from a different perspective. Just a quick few reflections. Well, she wasn't dying, as we might thought the person. She wasn't suffocating. What's really interesting is when you're studying children's lives and you're looking at physical behaviours, so much more sensory-rich data comes from that perspective than you got from the third-person perspective. Yet, people who work with children spend their lives in the third-person perspective observing children. They rarely get that opportunity to see children in children's lives from their own perspective. And there's so much more going on. There's so much more sensory-rich. You can hear her breathing. You can hear the effort. You can actually hear it physically, where she bumped things, and the celebrations that she made verbally when she got the thing to move. That kind of data is very, very hard to code in a behaviour coding scheme. So, some opportunities from using methods in this way. Well, cameras, particularly the ones worn first person, give you a whole different opportunity to really get up close and personal to them without physically being there. Wrapping up there. And so that gives you a privileged position that you don't normally get, and that's quite a powerful one. It has some provisos, and I'll mention those in a second. Also, and often people using video, particularly in visual research for children, don't often think about this, but actually cameras play a part themselves. They are actors in the context of this research. So not these static, objective tools, they actually influence the way that children and researchers work. And I have lots of kind of evidence of this in our own research, that children were informed, the way they acted was informed by these cameras. They played with them, they ran with them, they did all sorts of things with them. I took that in and absorbed that, and it kind of accepted that that was part of the research arena. I didn't neglect to tell you, I can't code any of that. That's part of what's going on. And of course, one of the things it does do, it captures children's real-time immediate behaviours in the context of their room. You have those. Of course, you remove them out of that context and you take them home, and months later you're coding them, all those kind of things. But at the point, you still have them as they were. It gives you a completely different perspective, maybe a shared perspective. It gives you an insight into children's world, as I said, that we wouldn't normally get. And of course, ethically, and this is where issues come, it gives you privileged access into the world. So I'm an adult stepping into the shoes of a child when I'm watching their films from their perspective. And that has implications for me as a researcher. The challenges are that if you're a static researcher and you're staying still and whether you're using cameras or not, you do miss action. You would never have this action unless you can either allow yourself or the cameras to be in the middle of that action. Tracking and adults, sometimes when they're involved in being with children, can interrupt the flow. And even in our second study where we had a tracking camera, it just so happens it was okay in that context because I was already having an intervention with stories and narratives, so the children ignored the camera being tracked by somebody else. But actually in any other context, in fact, the guys doing the research in America that I quoted earlier on, they actually use a tracking camera and follow individuals. And it has a huge impact on the way the children behave in that environment. Yeah. And so thinking about how we might use cameras about following children. Head cams make me sick, I'm going to leave that one there. Of course, one of the things that you do get from using cameras like this is audio. Anybody who's worked with film, you know that audio is very crucial. And in my studies, that was crucial because I'm after children's narrative. Of course, one of the dangers of using video, particularly in the environment that I was in, which is off-grid, is that you have this sense of surveillance going on. We kind of accepted that because the children accepted it because actually society is riddled with surveillance. Most of the streets have cameras in. Children are used to that. Families have photographic cameras and video cameras all the time and on holidays and things. Children are very used to having cameras around. And finally, I've kind of left it with this idea of lights, camera, action and filmmaking because at the end of the day, it is filmmaking. The moment I place a camera, even if it's on a pole in a tree, I am making a film. I'm using that film to tell a story and then I'm analysing that story. And actually, didn't have time to do it here, but I actually get the children into a room to re-story some of the films. They pick certain clips of their own films, and they get to tell me again what was going on. And that's being videoed as well, so that I get to re-story that event from their perspective. Thank you. Good question.